Some of the greatest achievements of early human civilization have long been swallowed by the silent passage of time, their once vibrant legacies obscured beneath layers of dust, forgotten ruins, and the slow erosion of memory. And yet, among all the cultural treasures that have vanished into the abyss of history, few evoke as much sorrow and speculative wonder as the great Library of Alexandria, a place whose very name stirs visions of candlelit halls, towering scroll-laden shelves, and an ancient sanctuary where the wisdom of ages once pulsed with life and possibility. This was not merely a library in the modern sense of the word. It was, by every known account, the most ambitious and awe-inspiring repository of human thought ever conceived in the ancient world. A sacred institution where history, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and the still uncharted mysteries of the cosmos were gathered, translated, studied, and preserved with almost religious devotion. It is believed that the Library of Alexandria contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, texts drawn from Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, India, and distant corners of the known world, many of which may have carried insights so profound, so far ahead of their time, that their loss may have forever altered the trajectory of our shared human story. And yet, despite its legendary status and unparalleled scope, not a single scroll, nor even a recognizable fragment, has survived to the present day. All of it, every word, every idea, every voice, has been lost, consumed by fire, shattered by conflict, neglected by rulers, or simply surrendered to the slow decay that comes when knowledge is no longer protected. This raises questions that echo through the centuries. How could such a monumental center of learning be allowed to vanish? And more hauntingly still, what exactly did we lose when it did? The origins of this unparalleled institution trace back to the early 3rd century BCE, during the reign of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Following the death of Alexander the Great, his general, Ptolemy III, established control over Egypt and chose the city of Alexandria, named in honor of his former commander, as the new seat of cultural and political power. But Ptolemy's ambitions, and those of his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, extended beyond military dominance or civic grandeur. Their vision was grander, more enduring. They sought to transform Alexandria into the intellectual epicenter of the ancient world. To achieve this, they founded the Museion, a grand academic sanctuary that would later inspire the modern concept of the museum. And at its heart stood the crown jewel, the great Library of Alexandria. It became a beacon that drew the brightest minds from across the ancient world. Poets, philosophers, physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, and scholars of every discipline were welcomed with open arms and open minds. Their works, their languages, their ideas, no matter how foreign, were embraced, copied, studied, and preserved. Ships entering Alexandria's bustling harbor were routinely searched for written documents. These were promptly copied by expert scribes, with the originals often kept in the library's growing vaults, while faithful reproductions were returned to their owners. In a relentless pursuit of knowledge, royal envoys were dispatched across continents to acquire rare texts, purchase entire private collections, and translate obscure works into Greek so that they could be studied and shared. Within its walls, the library is believed to have housed works of unimaginable value. The lost treatises of Aristotle, the teachings of Pythagoras, ancient Egyptian manuals on medicine, Mesopotamian star charts, and perhaps even writings from cultures that modern historians have never identified. Voices now silenced by time, their stories buried beneath forgotten centuries. And yet, for all its splendor and idealism, the library's end remains shrouded in uncertainty. there is no singular definitive account of its destruction. Instead, history offers us only fragments, conflicting narratives that paint a mosaic of possible ends, none of which can be confirmed with certainty. One of the earliest and most enduring theories holds that Julius Caesar, during his campaign in Egypt in 48 BCE, inadvertently set the first spark of its destruction. Trapped in Alexandria and under siege by forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII, Caesar ordered the burning of ships in the harbor to prevent their use by the enemy. According to several ancient sources, the flames spread from the docks into the city, consuming nearby warehouses where scrolls were stored, perhaps even portions of the library itself, though some historians suggest only peripheral storage buildings were affected, and not the core structure within the Mausoleum. The possibility remains that this was the beginning of the library's long, drawn-out demise. Centuries later, during the violent struggles of the 3rd century CE, Emperor Aurelian waged a fierce campaign to reclaim Alexandria from the control of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. Amid the urban warfare and widespread destruction, many parts of the city were reduced to rubble. It is believed by some that the Mausoleum, and with it any surviving portions of the library, may have perished during this turbulent era. Yet, as with so much of this story, definitive proof remains elusive. Another theory suggests that in the late 4th century, during a period of religious upheaval, the Christian bishop Theophilus spearheaded a campaign to eliminate pagan institutions. One of the casualties may have been the Serapeum, a majestic temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, which some accounts claim had come to house what remained of the library's collection. If true, then it is possible that what fragile remnants still endured were reduced to ash under the weight of dogma and fear. And finally, we come to the most controversial and often contested theory of all, that in 642 CE, during the Muslim conquest of Egypt, the library was destroyed by order of Caliph Umar. According to a later and widely debated account, when the victorious general Amr ibn al-As inquired about what to do with the library's scrolls, the caliph allegedly decreed that if the writings agreed with the Quran, they were redundant, and if they contradicted it, they were dangerous. In either case, he is said to have ordered them burned, with the scrolls supposedly fueling Alexandria's bathhouses for months. But this tale, recorded centuries after the event and viewed with deep skepticism by modern historians, may say more about later political narratives than it does about historical fact. In the end, the most painful wound may not lie in the fire or the sword, but in the absence, in the silence left behind. We do not know exactly what was lost, and perhaps we never will. Did the Library of Alexandria contain advanced astronomical theories that might have reshaped our understanding of the cosmos centuries before Galileo ever looked skyward? Did it hold the blueprints of forgotten technologies, records of long-lost civilizations, or medical knowledge that might have altered the fate of millions? Did it preserve insights into the human spirit, our myths, our beliefs, our early philosophies, that might have helped us better understand who we truly are? We know that towering intellects once passed through its halls, men like Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and Hipparchus. We know that Eratosthenes, using only basic tools and the shadows cast by the midday sun, calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy over 2,000 years ago. One can only wonder what other marvels were written down, studied, and perhaps even forgotten within those walls. Some scholars suggest that although the central collection was destroyed, many texts had already found new homes in other libraries, or had been passed from hand to hand across generations. That the influence of the Library of Alexandria continued to ripple outward like waves in a vast ocean long after the physical structure was gone. In this view, its destruction was more symbolic than total. A tragedy, yes, but not a complete annihilation. And yet, there remains something uniquely unsettling about the idea that an entire archive of ancient wisdom, a vast cathedral of knowledge built over generations, could vanish so completely, leaving behind only questions, legends, and longing. The fall of the Library of Alexandria stands as one of the most profound what-ifs in human history. What if it had endured? What if those precious scrolls had survived to guide us through the long shadows of the Middle Ages? What kind of world might we be living in now? We may never know. And therein lies the deeper tragedy, not only the loss of parchment and ink, but the loss of potential, of progress, of possibilities that now exist only in our imaginations. And so, the library lives on, not in its marble halls or candlelit corridors, but in the hearts of all who believe that knowledge is sacred, that memory must be preserved, and that the search for truth must never cease. The search for lost wisdom continues. The truth about our distant past is often cloaked in shadows, fragmented histories, civilizations that rose to dazzling heights, only to vanish mysteriously, leaving behind mere whispers of their former existence. Few legends embody this enigmatic allure more vividly than the elusive tale of Aztlan, the fabled ancestral homeland of the Aztecs, a city of such profound significance, yet one that has remained tantalizingly out of reach, never confirmed by archaeological discovery. Aztlan has long been described as a place shrouded in myth, an origin story gently passed through countless generations. Aztec ancestors recounted tales of a prosperous city, gracefully encircled by water, a place of purity and abundance. From this idyllic homeland, they began their epic migration southward, eventually founding the mighty city of Tenochtitlan, now resting beneath the bustling streets of modern-day Mexico City. The name Aztlan itself translates poetically as Place of the Herons, or Land of Whiteness, though its true meaning, like its exact location, remains steeped in ambiguity and endless scholarly debate. But what makes the legend of Aztlan uniquely captivating is the persistent belief that it was not merely allegory, but a physical place, a tangible city waiting silently to be rediscovered beneath the passage of centuries. Historians, archaeologists, and adventurers alike have tirelessly speculated about its whereabouts, their theories scattered across the map like stardust. Some envision Aztlan in northern Mexico, or even stretching into the American Southwest, near the tranquil waters of the Colorado River, or the stark beauty of the Great Salt Lake. Others imagine it nestled among islands in the Gulf of California, or submerged beneath the turquoise waves of the Caribbean Sea. Yet despite these compelling theories, no definitive trace, no ruins or artifacts, has ever conclusively been tied to Aztlan. Among the most intriguing hypotheses is the suggestion that this legendary homeland lay hidden in the rugged landscape of western Mexico, an area once flourishing with impressive ancient cities. Researchers frequently turn their gaze toward the ruins of La Quemada, a mysterious fortress-like site in the state of Zacatecas. Its formidable walls and massive stone structures unlike anything else found in the region. Could this isolated city, with its enigmatic fortifications, represent the last physical remnant of Aztlan, left behind as the Aztecs ventured southward? Yet even this tantalizing connection remains speculative, without clear archaeological confirmation. Others propose that Aztlan was not a single city, but rather a broader cultural nexus, a confederation of tribes sharing a common homeland before scattering across distant lands. The ancient Hohokam civilization, renowned for their sophisticated canal systems in present-day Arizona, has been tentatively linked to this possibility. Their advanced irrigation networks and sudden decline echo the mysterious disappearances of other lost cultures, leading some to wonder whether remnants of Aztlan's people might have migrated here before quietly fading from historical memory. Then, of course, there is the haunting possibility that Aztlan lies beneath the ocean, lost to rising seas over countless millennia. Much like Europe's sunken Doggerland or the mysterious submerged structures discovered off the coast of Cuba, perhaps Aztlan suffered a similar fate. If it were indeed an island civilization, evidence of its grandeur could now lie quietly beneath layers of sediment, hidden deep on the ocean floor, awaiting rediscovery by some future explorer. Intriguingly, parallels have even been drawn between the legend of Aztlan and the fabled Atlantis, both civilizations described as remarkably advanced, both mysteriously erased from history. Though no direct link exists, the echoes between these tales inspire tantalizing possibilities, fueling theories of an ancient global network of advanced cultures lost to the ravages of time. Yet mainstream archaeology remains cautious, with no conclusive proof to substantiate these extraordinary claims. Some even suggest that the Aztecs themselves may have intentionally obscured the true location of their ancestral homeland, either as a sacred secret or as a symbolic narrative, to strengthen their emerging identity within the Valley of Mexico. Origin myths often weave historical events with symbolic allegory, blurring the boundaries between myth and reality. Ultimately, whether Aztlan was a physical city or merely a powerful symbolic vision, its legend endures, captivating the imagination and urging us to look deeper into the gaps and silences of our historical understanding. The search for Aztlan is far more than a quest for a lost city. It's an exploration of human migration, evolution, and the enigmatic disappearance of entire peoples. It serves as a poignant reminder that history, no matter how detailed, is forever incomplete, forever filled with secrets, patiently waiting to be uncovered beneath the surface. And as we gaze into the quiet darkness tonight, contemplating the profound mysteries of Aztlan, we are gently reminded that some of the greatest marvels of our ancient past still await discovery, hidden quietly in the endless embrace of time. Some wonders of our ancient world remain hidden beneath oceans or obscured by dense jungles, but others stand proudly in plain sight, astonishingly visible, yet profoundly mysterious. Among these extraordinary relics, few capture the imagination, quite like the enigmatic Kailasa Temple in India, an architectural masterpiece whose very existence challenges our deepest understanding of what ancient civilizations could achieve. Located within the breathtaking Ellora Caves in Maharashtra, India, the Kailasa Temple initially appears to be just another grand spiritual monument among many scattered throughout the region. But as one moves closer, the realization sets in. This temple is profoundly different. It was not built in the conventional sense. It wasn't carefully assembled stone by stone, like the majestic pyramids of Egypt or the intricate temples found elsewhere in India. Instead, it was meticulously carved from a single massive mountain of basalt rock. The scale of this undertaking alone is nearly incomprehensible. To craft the Kailasa Temple, ancient builders had to remove approximately 200,000 tons of solid rock, sculpting downward, layer by painstaking layer, directly from the mountain's summit to its base, a method known as vertical excavation. This approach, rarely seen in ancient architecture, defies explanation. Unlike traditional construction methods involving scaffolding, bricks, and centuries of patient labor, Kailasa emerged gradually as the mountain itself was carefully cut away around it, revealing an astonishingly precise and detailed structure hidden within the earth. Yet despite the clarity of its existence, the temple's origins remain shrouded in mystery. Most scholars date its creation to the reign of King Krishna I of the Rashtrakuta dynasty during the 8th century CE, attributing its dedication to Lord Shiva, the supreme deity in Hinduism. The temple symbolizes Mount Kailash, Shiva's legendary and eternal abode. Yet strangely, no records survive, detailing exactly how such a monumental feat was accomplished or who possessed the vision and engineering prowess to realize such an ambitious design.